Oh, okay. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming. We'll just kick it right off with Bill Lake, the chief of the Media Bureau, giving an overview of what we're trying to accomplish today.
Great. Good morning. If I could have my first slide up. Well, good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you to this workshop on channel sharing in connection with the incentive auction for broadcast spectrum. This is the first in what we expect will be a series of workshops in which we'll invite input on issues to be explored as we move toward a proceeding to establish rules for the incentive auction. So what is channel sharing? Here's one artist's rendition that we found in the press recently, which suggests that channel sharing may be the solution to the age-old problem of who gets to decide what show we're watching tonight, or who gets to hold the remote. I should assure you that this is not what we have in mind for channel sharing. We would never divide the screen vertically into two pieces that way. We think horizontally would be much better. The best starting place to discuss this topic may be the statute that gave us our incentive auction authority. We've taken to calling it the Spectrum Act because that's much easier to say than Title VI of the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act of 2012. But they are one and the same. The President signed it into law on February 22nd, 3 months ago today. The law gives us the key authority that we need to hold an incentive auction, which we lacked under previous law, the authority to share auction proceeds with licensees who contribute spectrum to be sold in the auction. As enacted, the statute is true to the vision that we had in proposing the incentive auction idea in the broadband plan, that contributions by broadcasters to the auction will be strictly voluntary in exchange for a share of auction proceeds. The law lists 3 ways in which a broadcaster can offer to participate in the auction: by contributing a 6 megahertz license and taking that station off the air, by relinquishing spectrum in order to share a TV channel with one or more other licensees, or by moving from a UHF channel to a VHF channel. The idea behind channel sharing is that it can provide a way for a broadcaster to contribute spectrum to the auction, receive a capital infusion by sharing in the auction proceeds, and stay on the air and continue to serve its viewers. Channel sharing thus can help to meet the need we've identified to have more spectrum for mobile broadband service, while enabling the licensee to continue to perform the important role that broadcasting plays in our communications infrastructure. We're just now exploring a whole range of issues about the incentive auction, including how channel sharing can fit into the structure of the auction itself. We expect to be able to pose many of these issues in the rulemaking notices that we'll release later this year. But we recognize that if broadcasters are going to consider whether channel sharing is for them, they need to know as much as they can about what life would be like as a channel sharer. To begin to provide that information, we adopted an initial channel sharing order on April 27, just 2 months after the statute was enacted. In that order, we laid out some of the basics of how we see channel sharing working. We made clear that channel sharing will be arranged voluntarily between the sharing partners, and that stations will have a role in choosing their partners. The sharing of capacity between the stations will be on terms they set themselves, including dynamic allocation of bandwidth if they so choose, and subject to the requirement that each licensee continue to broadcast at least one standard definition stream of programming. Each channel sharing station will remain a separate FCC licensee with all of the rights and duties of a licensee, including the important right of must-carry. Sharing in connection with the auction will be available to full power and Class A stations, including those that are licensees today and applicants that have completed facility construction before the auction. And sharing will be possible between commercial and non-commercial licensees. The rules we've established relate to channel sharing only in connection with the incentive auction. We may address down the road whether to adopt rules for channel sharing outside the context of an auction. Without more, I'll turn things over back to Rebecca Hansen, our Senior Advisor for Broadcast Spectrum, who will introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Bill. Before we get started, just wanted to lay out a few housekeeping items. This session is being webcast on www.fcc.gov/live, and the archive of this webcast will be available either later today or tomorrow. This session will take place in two 45-minute sections, and we'll reserve time at the end of each section for questions. If you'd like to submit a question on a card, then just raise your hand and someone will give you a card. Otherwise, you can go to the microphone and ask your question at that time. If you're listening on the web, then please send your questions to the mailbox incentiveauctions@fcc.gov, and you can submit those questions confidentially. We won't state your name unless you want us to. And then for press who are in the audience, if you have any questions for the panelists, then feel free to ask them during the question period. Otherwise, if you have questions for the FCC, then we can have a separate session for you at the end of the panel. And with that, I will introduce our panelists. Thank you very much for coming this morning. We have John Hain from Pillsbury Winthrop. He's a media and telecom lawyer with Pillsbury's Communications Practice Group. John's work for broadcasters is focused on retransmission consent negotiations, spectrum and other technical matters, incentive auctions, next-generation broadcast standards, and reform of the FCC's broadcast ownership rules. John has been helping clients develop strategies for the upcoming incentive auctions, including scenario planning and financial modeling. He has received 3 patents for television, wireless, and satellite technologies. We also have Eric Da Silva, who is a partner in the communications practice at Wiley Rhine. Eric has 20 years of experience representing clients before the FCC, providing regulatory counsel about transactions that involve licensed spectrum, allocation of radio spectrum for new services, licensing of spectrum through auctions, spectrum clearing, and incumbent relocation, among other compliance matters. His focus for the past several years has been advising trade associations and companies on the technical, legal, and policy issues surrounding the reallocation of television broadcast spectrum for mobile broadband use and the development of incentive auctions. Next, we have Lana Thompson, who is the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer and General Counsel for the Association of Public Television Stations. Lana has been with APTS for 18 years. Prior to that, she was in private practice working in communications for 10 years. She has been giving channel sharing a lot of thought, working closely with CPB and PBS on behalf of her members. And then finally, we have John Cunney, who is a managing director and head of the U.S. Telecom, Media, and Technology Corporate and Investment Banking practice at Santander. John has nearly 15 years TMT investment banking experience, including with J.P. Morgan, HSBC, Media Venture Partners, and most recently Patrick Communications, with over $34 billion in closed deals. John has been both a leading wireless spectrum broker and television station broker, and his recent experience includes advising television broadcasters in both selling and buying television stations with significant spectrum value. John has advised on 5 announced transactions in the last 12 months. As Bill mentioned, the purpose of this workshop is to delve into the strategic and practical operational issues surrounding channel sharing. In the first half of this workshop, we will talk about the who and the why regarding channel sharing. Then in the second half, we'll go into the how of channel sharing and look at technical and more detailed contractual issues. But to kick it off for the panel, we've said from the beginning that participating in the auction may not be the right decision for all broadcasters, and that each of the 3 ways to participate that Bill laid out in his opening may be attractive to broadcasters in different business circumstances. So the first question for the panel is, what type of stations are likely to consider channel sharing over the other 2 options? John, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Is that on?
Should be. If it's not, say so.
I guess I'd say at the outset, stations will not be able to completely evaluate their interest in going forward until we know a lot more about what the particulars of the rules are. So my answer to this question, and frankly everything I say today, is based on a very, very high level 100,000-foot sort of view of the landscape, because the devil is in the details, and we're a long way from getting to the details at this point. So this is all sort of very, very high level. I think the answer is, part of the answer is a little bit obvious. Stations that are likely to consider channel sharing are stations that may not feel like they have or will continue to have a robust and profitable business going forward with a full channel, with the programming they have and with the business model they currently have. So I think WNBC is probably not created a committee to study whether their channel in New York should be shared. Stations that are more likely, and at the other end of the spectrum, I think, are stations that have little or no business plan at all and are looking at the spectrum auctions, but are looking, exclusively to exit altogether through the spectrum auctions and are not really interested in having a business to carry forward into the future. They just want to see if they can find a good exit opportunity through the spectrum auction. In between those extremes, I think you have a universe of people who may be interested in channel sharing. Those can include stations that have a viable economic model, whether it's public or commercial, that do not feel like they need to have the highest resolution full screen picture in order to maintain that business model. So I would think that would a lot of stations with niche programming, foreign language programming, some religious programming, which have a reason for operating and the financial wherewithal to operate, but would like to cut cost and perhaps get a capital infusion, and are not necessarily reliant on high-definition video. I think those would be good candidates.
And John, Connie, in your experience, who do you think is looking at channel sharing right now?
Yeah, I think so. My background is as a financial advisor, so I'm just sort of looking at this from a financial point of view. As John said, there are, and as the FCC has had in a lot of presentations, when you look at the spectrum value of certain stations versus the broadcast value, there are a lot of stations where the broadcast value is significantly higher than the spectrum value, and those guys are not going to be interested in selling their full station. If you're below that from a financial point of view, if you have a station that is not creating a lot of cash flow, then it's sort of a no-brainer from my point of view that this if you can participate, it makes a lot of sense. And that's what I'm seeing from clients I've talked to. In looking at who's going to, out of that group of who have broadcast value that they don't want to give up, who of them are going to participate in channel sharing, I think there are a couple things that will stop people from doing that. So one is if you have big operators like WNBC, for instance, who have just tremendous broadcast value and don't really want to deal with the risk of potentially sharing and going through that process, I think they're not going to participate. The other people who are not going to participate are people who place a high value on future technologies and the ability to use their spectrum other than their primary stream. So I've talked to people who have a view that mobile TV is going to be a huge value creation for them in the future, or other type of enhanced services that they can use with new technologies. So I think those players are not interested in participating in channel sharing. The people who are interested are traditional broadcasters who think they have, one primary station, one primary channel that creates a lot of value and that benefits from the must-carry rules, and then they see the value of selling their spectrum based on the valuations that we're seeing might come out of the incentive auction.
Thank you. In the comments we received in our in the channel sharing NPRM, there were many concerns about the FCC having a role in pairing up broadcasters to channel share. And in our report and order, we state that our rules would not allow us to do that. So as broadcasters consider channel sharing, what considerations go into identifying an acceptable channel sharing partner? Eric?
I've indicated, what you're talking about are people who want to continue to be broadcasters, and what you're really sort of emphasizing here is that you're changing your cost model going forward. What that means is that you've got to start looking, if you're trying to find an acceptable partner, to find somebody who's going to be able to generate efficiencies through shared operations that are going to be meaningful to your business model tomorrow. I would think situations that involve common ownership, for example, are ones where you don't have the overhang of the transactional overhang that could complicate decision making going forward. You may be able to do things that generate additional efficiencies, like actually dynamically sharing the bit stream, that you may not be willing to do with somebody who's an unrelated third party. Common programming may be an area where you could generate some efficiencies as well. Common facilities. I mean, you may have a situation where you are both already on the same broadcast facility. That may make the initial startup of a channel sharing operation a lot simpler. I think you might also look to, and I'm going to sort of be a little bit vaguer here, but a common philosophy. If you've got two stations that are both prioritizing religious education or service to the Hispanic community, you might find that that shared business philosophy actually facilitates some of the decision making that you have to do going forward. But there are also situations, I think, where you may find that the differences are ones that create the value. If your business is one where, as they've said, that you're not prioritizing delivering the highest quality bit stream, your goals are going to be satisfied with getting a standard definition stream out there, you may be able to talk to people who are originally conceiving of channel sharing as a sort of up the middle arrangement, and it may open up additional opportunities for you, something that's asymmetrical. So there may be differences there that could help. You could also look at situations where your contours are quite different. Perhaps somebody wants to alter their contour because your sort of what you are sharing on is going to define your business moving forward. So that's another opportunity to look at.
Lana, among public television stations, what considerations go into channel sharing? Eric mentioned sort of a common philosophy. Are you finding that in the public television world?
It's interesting. Just a little bit of background about our public television system to answer that question, Rebecca. We have 170 licensees that operate 350 stations across the country. And they are not a network in the sense of the usual sense of a network. They're all locally owned and operated, and they all make their own local decisions under their licensees. We have a unique mix of licensees. Some of our stations are community licensees. They've been created by their communities. Others have state licensees, others universities and colleges or school districts. So while they share the common philosophy of the mission of public service, the structure is very unique and different to each one of our stations. APTS, and as you mentioned, Rebecca, with our sister organizations, PBS and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, has spent a lot of time the last couple of years talking to our stations about the possible opportunities in this spectrum, both in the auction and in the channel sharing. We're pretty new into this. I mean, there are a lot of unanswered questions, as John said. We hope to know more in the fall or before when the rulemaking comes out. But our stations are and always have been very entrepreneurial. contrary to perhaps what some members of Congress think. We don't just rely on our federal funding. Our federal funding is incredibly important because it's the seed money that allows our stations to grow their other funding. So for every dollar of federal funding our stations receive, they grow $6 based on other sources, communities, donors, business donors, underwriters, state funding. So they're looking at this the way they look at all opportunities to see if there is a mix where they can continue to pursue their public service mission while taking advantage of some opportunities that wouldn't diminish the public service that they provide in any way. One other aspect that makes us unique is we have a statutory obligation, it's part of our mission, to provide universal service. And our stations serve 99.99% of this country. Many places where our stations serve, they're the only broadcast service available to the public. So we as a system and our stations individually take that mandate seriously. And so as looking as to what situations would work and which partners will work, we constantly have to keep in mind that we can't diminish quality of services, and we need to always assure universal service around the country.
So that would play a big part in, say, deciding which tower or which frequency two channel sharing partners would like to be on. I'm assuming.
Yes, absolutely.
And in the commercial world, John Cunney, how are potential sharing partners looking at, is there a preference for particular frequency or tower that you're aware of in those discussions?
Yeah, I think actually this is a fun question because it's just really a financial exercise, right? So I think when looking at a partner, or once you have a partner, determining which tower station you use and which you put in for the incentive auction, you really you go through the financial exercise of you have to value each one. First of all, when you're looking at a partner, you have to make sure that you have a station that is a good candidate for your auction, and that will likely be taken. And then and you look at the value of that station will likely generate in the auction. And then in addition, you have to look at the broadcast value. So I think most people can sort of look at the broadcast value of the two stations and determine which one will be more valuable. The spectrum is a little bit more difficult and requires more analysis. But once you sort of come up with those two values, then I think it comes down to just a couple scenarios. One, you have one station that has better spectrum value than the other, and the other one has better broadcast value, and so it's a no-brainer. You keep that one and you hand the other one into the FCC. The second scenario is, and this is actually going to be kind of likely, I think this will happen, is that you'll have one station has a higher broadcast value and both other stations have similar or equal spectrum value. And in that case, you just keep the one, obviously, with the better broadcast value and turn in these stations with the better spectrum value. And then the third one is sort of the dilemma where you have one station that has both better spectrum value and better broadcast value. And that's when you start negotiating. So you figure out, I think these are going to be complicated valuation exercises to determine when you're partnering how you're going to share the proceeds from the auction, because I don't think it should be 50-50 in most cases. And it's going to come down to negotiating and doing good valuation analysis.
Becca, if I may just add another thought in terms of your discussion, John, on the broadcast value, just to underscore that includes the cable carriage penetration and satellite and telco penetration as well. I know that's critically important to our stations. We have privately negotiated agreements with various cable companies, satellite companies, and telcos. And so if two stations are looking at sharing, naturally it's important to know too whether each station is reaching cable head ends that are essential to reach populations. I would also think it'd be very important if a station's considering moving from a UHF channel into a VHF channel. If there's a large penetration of satellite and cable and telco carriage, then perhaps that decision becomes easier. But we've been talking with our stations about that as being a critical element as well.
I would add, one consideration is that no matter what decisions you make about who's got the best broadcast value and which station has the best spectrum value, you have to discount that a little bit because we don't really know what's going to happen in repacking. So we don't necessarily know that if we choose a tower site, we know our tower site and we think we know what our contours are, but we don't know that the channel is going to remain constant. Even if it's in the lower part of the band, it could be moved in repacking. Now, I suspect the FCC, to reduce repacking costs, is going to move the smallest number of stations in the non-cleared part of the band as possible. But it's certainly possible that you could be in the lower part, you could have a lower channel, and you could nonetheless be repacked. So you have to be very careful how much weight you assign to the broadcast value of any particular facility, even if you expect that to be the facility that you're remaining on. In fact, it's the license you're remaining on, and it's sort of a marker for the coverage area, and certainly the tower that you expect to retain. But it's not necessarily the precise technical facility that you're going to have going into repacking.
Okay, Eric, the FCC today writes auction rules that prohibit communication among competitors for a period of time before a spectrum auction to avoid collusive behavior that could distort auction outcomes. But incentive auctions open up a new territory for us, particularly in the area of auction design rules for the supply side or the reverse auction. Given the fact that we are still in the process of working through these new rules, are there any areas in which potential channel sharers may want to start discussions now need to tread carefully?
I think the situation that we're looking at right now, the whole idea of channel sharing and the basis of channel sharing is the concept that you're going to have two people who might otherwise participate in an auction who are having discussions with one another with the net result or the intended result that they will participate in the auction together. I think in a broader sense where you have people in an auction who are essentially reducing the competition in the auction, that may strike, you may have issues under the sort of Department of Justice and anti-collusion rules there or antitrust rules there. I think the difference that you have here is that you have a statute that says this is an activity that's permissible, and you are going to have FCC rules that say this is something that is permissible and this is something that you can do. So when people are having discussions about this, I think you're probably not going to raise any issues if you end up concluding a channel sharing arrangement that fits neatly within the FCC's rules. I think the area where people need to be a little bit more cautious, and I think this is sort of where the discussions can get impacted, is if you conceive of the situation where you have two people talking to one another and they don't end up concluding an arrangement, where you have significant discussions between auction participants and you have at the end of the day a scenario that does not neatly fit within the FCC's sort of channel sharing regime. So I think it's important for people when they engage in these kinds of discussions to make sure that everybody understands that if you end up going your separate ways and you cannot reach agreement, that essentially all bets are off, that there is no agreement there, to be very clear that the discussions that you have had all been in the context of a post-auction market structure where you are both combined together. But to avoid making people too paranoid, this is not something that the FCC hasn't dealt with before. We have had, in the context of forward auctions, which are essentially the kind of mobile and other auctions that you've seen in the past, the FCC has authorized the formation, some of these auctions of bidding consortia, where you have more than one bidder that can get together and they can bid jointly. These rules have survived anti-collusion review, and people have managed to do these things without getting taken to task by the Department of Justice. So it's an area where, again, you're going to have to read the rules very carefully when they come out. I think you're going to have to be careful in your initial discussions and to make sure that everybody understands that if there's a walkaway, it really is a walkaway, and there's no agreement left over. So that's the practical advice I think I would give.
Well, this is an area that we're going to be looking at very closely, and so we'll appreciate all of your input as we work through that rulemaking process. Anybody else on this? Any words of caution in this area yet? No? Are there any other, or John, one of the Johns, are there any other practical business issues that potential sharing stations are encountering in the planning stages, even before they get to possible deal terms?
Most of my analysis has been on picking partners and doing the valuation there. And I go back, I would like to just point out one thing that I think might have been glossed over before, but in picking partners, and this is a practical business issue, the incentive auctions are pretty uncertain, and there are plenty of stations in major markets that are not going to be able to participate in an incentive auction even if they want to. So picking a good partner, it's important to determine, at least one of the stations the station that you're deciding to turn in is a good candidate for the incentive auction. And then I think a practical matter for that in the negotiations is, well, how do you unwind it if it doesn't happen? You have to build the agreement in a way that if your auction bid is not accepted, if it's too high or in the reverse auction, or if it just doesn't fit in, if it's a station that is not needed for the repack, then how does the whole process unwind? I think that's a practical matter that needs to be looked at.
One other sort of practical issue that people may run into right up front as well is, there may be stations that are considering the concept of channel sharing because they want to remain broadcasters at the end of the day. But you sort of have to think about the fact that, at some point everybody is going to be willing, given enough money, everybody is going to be willing to say, well, I'm just going to turn it in. I mean, the way people, I think, and the FCC hasn't been sort of specific about whether the auction procedures will allow this or not, but I think there's a lot of people who think that the way that the auction may be structured, you may have the opportunity to say, here's the price at which I'm going to be willing to share with somebody, and here's the price at which I'm going to, be willing to turn in my station. And if you have alternative scenarios like that, and you're working with a sharing partner, obviously the decision has to be, you have to work around those things very carefully about when you sort of move away from the potential for sharing in the context of the auction, what happens when the bids get evaluated, and how that, affects other people, because you can't have a situation where you're trying to renegotiate that on the fly in the middle of the auction. So that's an area to be very clear about, I think, up front.
Yeah, and I think that's one area where you could run into anti-collusion rules during the course of the auction. There's more demand than we anticipated. What do you say we split this up and we both bid in? Is it too late for that? Or there's not much demand. What can we do to create more demand to bring the pricing up? Certainly that's definitely an issue. I think the other thing that Eric points out is if you go into this really wanting to come out the other side in a shared scenario, you need to make sure that your partner is also of the same mindset. So you want to control the exit not only afterwards if your bid is not accepted, but during the course of the auction process. You want to know. You may want to know that you're joined at the hip. If the auction rules permit it, you may want to find a partner that is like-minded, that is willing to go their separate ways if that's an opportunity. I think at least my clients at this point have not gotten to the point of figuring out what they're looking for in a channel sharing partner. I think most of them at this point are trying to get their heads around spectrum valuations for their particular stations and their particular markets. They want to understand what the currency is, what the value is, what the potential demand is. They're still trying to get a picture of the market in a big sense. So most of the work that I've been doing has been focused, much less on who the particular sharing candidates are, and much more on, what are the bases for determining the particular valuation of a particular station in a particular market at the time of the auction, under various scenarios. And I mean, that in and of itself entails some fairly non-obvious considerations. And so I think that's probably a first step. If you find that the values are possibly your projected values are at one level, that may lead you in a certain direction. If you find the values that are another level, that may lead you to say I'm not interested, or maybe I'm interested in a channel sharing arrangement. I think another factor that plays in is where your market stands under the ownership rules. And this is not intended as a criticism. It's just an observation. The political process is what it is. But I do see the FCC sort of working at cross purposes to itself in one sense. If you want to create value out of a resource, you want as much liquidity as possible. I mean, that's economics, 101, right? I mean, that's why the market for commodities became so much more efficient when they invented futures contracts. You made a delivery of a farmer's wheat, something that was much more granular, no pun intended. Actually, that's a very good pun. I'll use that again. And in this situation, you have the FCC, on the one hand saying, I want as many parties as possible to participate in this process to generate spectrum to bid into the auction so that we can, repack and reclaim spectrum at the top of the band. But you're also telling the holders of those resources, you're telling the farmers, with those crops of grain, you can only trade in your entire delivery of grain at the end of the year, right? You can't acquire rights in the next farmer's grain next door. You can't sell futures contracts. You're locking me into one or two channels in each market. You're not allowing me to get bigger than that. So, maybe I'm not making myself very clear, but in terms of people who may be willing to bid into the auction, it's a very different scenario if bidding into the auction substantially changes your business operations, changes you from going from high definition to standard definition, or changes you from operating to not operating at all because you bid your spectrum in. That's a pretty big change, right? You've got to decide that you want to permanently limit your business opportunities and prospects and operations, or exit the business altogether. And that's a fairly binary decision if you only have one station in a market. If I had, and part of the presumption behind the FCC's auction is that there are really more stations out there than the country needs. So if I have 4 stations in a market with 9 stations, I'm far more likely to be able to sit down and without talking to anybody else, without colluding and without worrying about the behavior of third parties in the auction and after the auction, I can decide to channel share and bid 2 stations in. Or I can decide to consolidate all my operations perhaps on 1 or 2 stations and bid 2 stations in. So, I think when you have an ownership proceeding going forward that's not going to relax, and in fact in many senses is going to tighten the existing ownership rules, ironically with respect to SSAs, which is one of the things we're talking about here, right, is an advanced form of SSA, is channel sharing. And then you have a separate process going forward in which the FCC is trying to encourage stations to bid in, while at the same time it's sort of freezing the liquidity of stations to do things that are market enhancing. I think that's a drag on the process. I think it's a political reality, but in terms of a pure market, which is what you're looking for in an auction process, I think it's a drag. I don't know if anybody from the Media Bureau is here today, but
other than Rebecca and Bill.
Well, that observation has been made in a variety of comments. I think it's fair to say it's beyond the scope of this workshop to solve it, but it is duly noted. And with that, maybe we'll take a break to see if there are any questions in the audience. If anyone wants a piece of paper or anyone wants to step up to the mic.
Hi, I'm Coleman Bazelon from the Brattle Group. So a bunch of comments were made about comparing the broadcast value to the spectrum value, and I'm a little confused at what's in your mind about that, just because the amount that a station will get paid in the auction is not related to the value of the spectrum, except in a very sort of big picture sense about how much is being cleared. It's not related to the value of a particular station's spectrum contribution to the auction. Nor do we know what that's going to be until we play out the auction. If we knew what it was going to be, we could avoid the trouble and just negotiate a bunch of deals. So I'm curious what you have in mind when you talk about spectrum value and the decision process that you're comparing that to when giving up the license versus sharing versus moving to VHF.
Right. So what we do for our clients is, you're right, spectrum value is not necessarily tied to, is not the same as the value that you are likely to receive in the incentive auction. However, there's analysis that you could do to come up with an estimate on what that auction value will be. And it may or may not have something to do with spectrum value. But certainly, if you're trying to decide whether to participate in an auction, it makes sense to come up with a good estimate on on how that auction is going to run, what the values are going to be, what stations are going to be taken out, what stations won't be taken out, and given the overall value for the whole auction and the competing bidders, for instance, in a market. So let's say take New York, and you are looking at, a certain number of stations need to be cleared. What is it going to cost the government to clear that many stations? And you can come up with estimates on what that auction value is. So I probably misspoke, and I should have said, while we do look at spectrum value, because I think that's the underlying value of the whole thing, and you need to understand that, you also need to look at the value that you think you're going to get in an auction. And there are ways to estimate that.
I'm not sure there isn't a difference. I mean, I don't think we have enough rules yet to know. How is the FCC going to determine the value to it in its decisions of where to draw the lines of what bids should be accepted? Will it place the same value on every station, or will it place different values on stations depending on their contours, or if not depending on their contours, depending on something that's actually more important, which is what the preclusive effect of that allocation is, and how much flexibility it gives the station in the repacking. We do know, I think, that the broadcast value is enhanced for a station that retains the largest possible contour post-auction. So I'm not sure those factors are. It may be that there's no difference between those factors, Coleman, and it may be, depending on the rules, there's a significant difference. I think we have to see how the FCC draws its rules.
Are public television stations taking a different view of valuation other than what we've heard this morning?
Well, this is a unique question for our station. So we were actually looking at this for a first time in terms of the value of the spectrum and the value of the broadcast station. I mean, I think clearly not all broadcast stations are equal. The contour of some reaches more populations. For our guys, which is critically important, the infrastructure of some stations is a lot newer and better than other infrastructure. And a constant renewal of facilities is very taxing for our stations. So the newer infrastructure is obviously important. I had mentioned earlier the cable and satellite head-end reach is critically important for our stations as well. So I do think there's a difference in values of broadcast stations, and I do think within the spectrum, as we look, clearly the top 30 markets are very much in focus now, but stations around the country that have UHF signals, or stations that might, in crowded corridors, that may make the repacking more simple, I think really have some valuable spectrum that they're licensed to right now. So we've been brainstorming with our stations around all of those scenarios. I think for us, what makes a critical difference, I mentioned earlier, is the licensee type and the universal service. When you look at most of the, say, the top 30 markets, in all but 8 markets, we have multiple stations. And so it seems sort of a no-brainer that the dialogue should begin among non-commercial stations and commercial stations and non-commercial stations in neighboring markets. But within that, again, we have to keep in mind what are the programming services that those stations are providing to the public. And John, you referenced this, I think, in your earlier comments. If you look, for example, here at the metropolitan D.C. area, we have 4 licensee types, and they're very, very different. We have WETA, which is a community licensee. We have Maryland Public Television, which is a state licensee and which has promised the people in Maryland and the state legislature and its governor many types of programming that they've come through on, such as the Maryland channel, which is a really unique SD service, which is incredibly important to not only the station but the people receiving it. They do a lot of educational services. Maryland is ranked number 1 in terms of testing, and the actual that has actually been credited to Maryland Public Television by the previous superintendent of schools, Nancy Grasnick, who just retired from her position. So that station is not going to be broadcasting necessarily the same programming WETA is. You throw on top of that WHUT, licensed to Howard University, which does wonderful, unique programming on a really small budget for diverse audiences. And then in Northern Virginia, we have Megahertz, which does foreign language and all sorts of news programming from around the world. So it's difficult for our stations to value, their services and spectrum in the traditional sense, and certainly not in a commercial sense. But I think, as I said earlier, I think there are unique opportunities here to really look at whether we can continue to provide all those services that we're providing now, and that's just in this metropolitan D.C. market, while being entrepreneurial, perhaps saving on programming or infrastructure costs, and not diminishing service to our public.
Oh, I had a request. Oh, go ahead, Dick. But when you are answering questions, your name tags are not showing up on the webcast. So I'll try to say your name, but if you can try to remember to just say your name before you answer the question.
Does this help?
That it's not.
Oh, okay.
You can try it. I don't know, but if you could try to say, that's much better. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Dick Zaragoza. I think in some earlier comments, months prior, Bill Lake and Rebecca and others have touted you might call them on a macro basis, the benefit to a particular market, that the more stations that turn in their license or share or what have you. If that is an important goal to incentivize, that in a sense that's a non-monetary incentive for stations that will be remaining to encourage some of their competitors to turn in their licenses. So the question is, if that's true, would it be permissible under the Commission's regulations as a third-party, quote, fat cat broadcaster in town to do what I could do to encourage John and Eric to combine their stations, or for John to turn in his license, even to the point of guaranteeing them some type of floor in the amount of money that they would get back as a result of turning in their license? Thank you.
Well, I think that clearly falls within the category of discussions that we're going to look very carefully at with respect to influencing the outcome of an auction. But, I'd like...
You're treading into some...
This is Eric Da Silva for the web audience.
I think you're certainly treading into a lot more dangerous sort of territory there. At a minimum, in prior auctions, the FCC has sort of required disclosure of all agreements that relate to bidding. So at a minimum, I think you're going to be, if you've got some agreement with somebody that says you're going to give them at least a certain amount or a guarantee of a certain amount in the auction, and you're both participating, that at least is going to have to be something that is disclosed, I think. And once it is disclosed, I think you're going to have to deal with the potential impact of, whether that is something that is going to lessen competition. It's not something I think I've thought about a whole lot at this point. It's a little new, but I think I would be very careful and seek good counsel on that one. So.
I have no problem, under my scenario, I have no problem with disclosure, but it seems to me that to the extent that the private industry has come to help subsidize the turn-in cost, it actually benefits the government because they can get their cake and eat it too. They get increased chances a license will be turned in for the reasons we're all here, and secondly, perhaps for less money.
I think it's a terrific idea, Dick, and I think the subsidizing station should get a tax certificate because it advances public policy. Do we have anybody from the IRS here?
I'll make sure the IRS knows that was John Hain who was answering.
And my Social Security number is XXX.
You're going to be audited now.
Well, in answering these past few questions, the issue of contour and power has come up, and we received a question from Michael Richards, an attorney, who asked if a lower-powered licensee through channel sharing moves to a second stream that is licensed for higher power, will the lower-powered licensee be allowed to expand its contours, or will there be some technical limit placed to force a station to keep its more modest contours? It's my recollection that we did not address this issue in the report and order, but as a technical matter, I thought I'd take an opportunity to introduce. We're lucky to have Brian Markwalter in the audience with us. Brian is Senior Vice President at the Consumer Electronics Association of Research and Standards, and he's also on the board of ATSC. So, Brian, if you don't mind, as a technical matter, would it be possible for channel sharing stations to broadcast at different power levels and with different contours, or would the 6 megahertz have one contour and one power level?
Yeah, so again, this is Brian Markwalter. So it's clearly one RF signal, so it's going to have one contour, and that's part of what the order talks about and what the panelists talked about. That's part of your consideration is what coverage you're going to get for carriage and other reasons, as Lana mentioned. So once you combine, in your decision making about which station, which RF channel you're going to use, and it's complicated, as John pointed out, by some uncertainty around that, but that is part of it. You're going to become part of one RF signal, two different virtual channels, if you will, in one RF signal, and therefore you're going to have a certain reach that is going to be identical for those two channel sharing partners.
Thank you.
Sounds like marriage, Rebecca.
That brings up an interesting point, which I think we talked about before, in choosing the right partner, right? If you have two stations that have significantly different contours, that you have to look into. Well, is the one that's giving up their contour even a candidate to participate in the auction? And if they are, what clearing price might they go for? And then there's certainly going to be a lot of negotiating. If you are increasing your broadcast value significantly because now you have a much larger contour, then I think the owner of the larger station has a good argument for getting a much larger piece of the auction proceeds. So.
But I think one thing that it does illustrate here, though, is people tend to view sharing as essentially a zero-sum game. What I'm giving up is what you're getting, but I think it does illustrate that when you're looking at the actual contours itself, there is a potential for some expansion here in terms of the business that you can create post auction. So just
Just another Yeah. And again, this is part of your thinking about as I'm thinking, should I share, should I turn my license in? Would the commission, or should the commission permit me to declare my intention to turn in my license at a certain reserve amount? At the same time, I have a contingent sharing agreement that I've also told the commission about, but I don't intend to implement that agreement if you'll buy my station, the full 6 megahertz for X dollars. So I've at least, hedged my bets. And the question is, does that give the commission enough certainty so it knows what spectrum is actually going to be there?
I don't see why they shouldn't. I mean, we sort of talked about this a little bit with, the auction rules aren't out. I don't think it's clear whether the commission could very well say, no, you get to elect A, B, or C. This isn't something where you can do more than one. But, theoretically, what the commission is trying to do here is to repack the UHF band in a way that generates the largest spectrum dividend at the lowest net cost to the agency and sort of the auction revenues. And the more options that they have, I guess in my mind at least, the better chance they have of coming up with an arrangement that is going to be the most beneficial in terms of the amount of spectrum cleared. Now, it does make their job an awful lot more difficult if you have to evaluate multiple scenarios. And I think you do need to sort of, again, pay attention to the fact that if people are going to be submitting more than one kind of bid or more than one option in the auction, how those things are going to relate to one another. And, if your partner is 100% committing to channel sharing and you go, oh, well, sorry about that, they accepted my bid to go dark, I like that one better, you may think you need to be pretty clear about what you're doing.
And with that, why don't we go ahead and take a 10-minute break? Okay. All right, so now we'd like to switch gears a little bit and focus more on the technical details about how channel sharing might work. We've discussed the high-level strategic issues, and we understand there are a lot of open questions. But assuming that those questions are answered and there are stations that end up channel sharing, I'd like to know what the panel thinks that channel sharing agreements will actually look like. For example, with respect to the length of time that they cover, renewals, capacity sharing, facility modifications, maintenance responsibility. How do you think on a contractual level 2 stations will work out their operating relationship? Lana, do you want to kick that off?
This is precisely why I left private practice, Rebecca. These guys can answer. No, I'm teasing. I mean, it's clearly something our stations are thinking about. I think I don't have answers to all the specifics around, the questions of, who does maintenance and what's the length and term, et cetera. But I do think the overriding consideration is, as was mentioned earlier, this is one signal that we're looking at. And so I think the questions that will be important are what happens when one of either the host station or the sharing station has a problem with license renewal, or what happens if one of the stations goes into bankruptcy, or what happens if one of the stations wants to assign or transfer its license. Those are really thorny questions that I don't have the answers to, but there's certainly things that I think that we need to be considering when we're forging these channel sharing arrangements. The other piece of it that's really important to our stations is because we sit on the reserve spectrum, we have sort of, again, a unique situation with public television. But if a commercial and non-commercial station are sharing, in addition to the questions we talked about earlier, like the economic and technical questions of which channel do you take, which spectrum do you take, I think there are a lot of legal issues around that and regulatory issues in terms of whether the spectrum remains reserve spectrum or or de-reserved. And I know that's something that we're going to be looking at with the FCC, the community and the FCC going forward. But those are critical questions when we're looking at channel sharing agreements.
Anybody else?
Well, for better or worse, the FCC has sort of left, how you go about sharing as a wide open topic. I mean, it sort of allows people to structure these relationships any way that they want. And I think the only real given here that you have is that when you enter into a channel sharing arrangement, there's no way of unwinding it post-auction. So what you're talking about, and I think there's a lot of things that sort of fall out of that. You have a situation where the parties simply cannot both go their separate ways and return to what they were doing before. Therefore, you have an agreement that has to essentially be in perpetuity, where you have to address what happens and the kinds of circumstances that exist that could cause the relationship to be one where you want to, somebody wants to leave, or somebody has to leave because their license didn't get renewed or, God forbid, got revoked or something like that. But there's also commercial situations where somebody could desire to end the relationship or to move out of the relationship, selling it to a third party. And I think the way that you structure this relationship is going to have to do a lot with how you address those possibilities. I mean, one of the things that I sort of have been thinking about is, do you have a separate channel sharing agreement and a separate facilities agreement? Do you separate the two pieces of them? Because they don't necessarily have to be, all bound up in the same arrangement. And it's quite possible that in the most likely exit event, which would seem to me to be the case where somebody says, I've got an offer on the table, I want to leave, I'm now going to put you into business with somebody who you don't know, that you may want to keep those things separate because you can do things like say, okay, we'll let you get out of this arrangement and we'll let you sell it to a third party, but that's going to change the way that we maintain the facility. Either my interest in the facility itself is going to increase. I'm going to have more decision-making authority over how the facility is maintained, for example. Whereas if it's somebody who you know and somebody you trust in the beginning, you may be much more willing to have a situation where, your physical transmitter facilities are much more, you deal with questions a little bit more ad hoc. So, I mean, the idea of having to structure for various contingencies that get people out of this strikes me to be one where you really have to do a little bit of thinking. I mean, people contract around these kind of things all the time, so this isn't necessarily an insurmountable task, but it's one I think you really need to spend some time thinking about.
Yeah, this is this is one of the 5 or 6 most interesting questions, I think, in this process. You can have a lot of fun sitting down with a whiteboard sort of thinking about this. Lawyers like to run back to templates from other kinds of deals that have been thought through very carefully, so you can make sure you don't miss anything. There are no absolutely analogous on all fours deals that I can think of, certainly in the telecom space or elsewhere, that deal with facility sharing where you're actually sharing the same RF channel with a separate license. There are many situations in which the same chunk of spectrum has been shared by people with different facilities. But I don't think there's anything exactly of this analogy. I have done some work I do a lot of work in the satellite space. There's another pun. That's 2. If you're keeping score. John 2. Everybody else.
Not holding up.
I don't know. There are a lot because satellites are very expensive to build and launch, and sometimes they have additional capacity. There are many situations in which 2 different parties share the same satellite bus. They will sometimes, but not always, have separate licenses. They'll usually have different frequencies. But I think many of the situations there are similar because you've got a facility that you're totally bound together on that facility for the life of the satellite, which is 15 to 20 years. And the things that you care about in that environment are your partner being financially viable and able to live up to its financial obligations. You are concerned about assignability and approval of who the party that the other part of the satellite is assigned to. You're concerned about cure rights if the other party defaults on any obligations that's going to put it into trouble that may indirectly affect you. You want to be able to step in and cure the defaults of the other party. You're worried about dispute resolution. You want small disputes to be handled quickly and efficiently. You want to be sure there's continuity of operations. And then you have different sorts of considerations that are going to pop up here that don't pop up in the satellite space or anywhere else that I can think of. Division of operations. The FCC has said in this order one licensee has to maintain enough capability to run an SD channel, I think 24/7. If it wasn't said that way, it was implied that way, which I find interesting because a licensee today doesn't have to operate 24/7. Their minimum operating hours, I don't recall what they are, but they're very slim. So, and again, going to my point of liquidity, giving the parties as much flexibility as possible to craft arrangements that are economically efficient for both of them, leading more people to step into the auction process and participate because they found arrangements that work. Why can't I have sort of a TD rather than FD? I mean, a time division rather than a frequency division sort of approach to this, such that maybe one station has shuts off during prime time, right? And is meeting its audience's need other times of the day with a standard definition or maybe even a high definition channel. We have a rule that's been adopted. Perhaps it could be decided in the future that there are more efficient ways to go about this, particularly with more and more time shifting. Maybe a 24/7 SD channel is sort of not the right way to think about the world going forward in the future. By the time these auctions are had, maybe we'll decide that SD channels are fine for everybody because they're all watching on a 7-inch tablet screen. So, I think the operating rules themselves, even within the strictures of whatever the FCC designates, there's an enormous amount of flexibility there, and people are going to want to think long and hard about very creative approaches to maximizing the value.
Just to clarify, if I remember correctly, the report and order does not state 24/7. We say that sharers have to retain a minimum capacity to air one SD stream over the air at no direct charge to viewers.
Right.
I believe is the standard, and Sean can correct me if I got that wrong. But you raised a number of concerns which we've considered, and it's led us to wonder whether or not there's a market for some sort of independent third-party tower management. To use your satellite example, quite often the satellite operator will be separate from the service providers that are on that satellite, and that allows them to go to a relatively independent third party to resolve these disputes, et cetera. Do you think in the channel sharing environment there is a market or an opportunity for independent third-party channel sharing station management?
I think it's a matter of scale. If you have only 2 stations in a small market sharing, bringing in a third-party manager is just going to be a cost item. That party is going to want to make a profit. It's not going to have a very big business because they're only going to be servicing you. And while in theory that might be a good approach, in reality, there's probably not enough money in the value chain for that. If you have a larger market and you have 6 stations sharing or 8 stations sharing on 3 or 4 different channels, and you have one operator, then that's probably a very, very efficient way to go. So I think that'll vary on market size and the specifics of each market.
With that said, though, there may be ways to objectify some of the kinds of maintenance issues that you have to deal with short of sending it off to a third party. You may be able to look to certain sort of engineering standards or sort of prudent engineering kind of things in order to divide the costs up so that you're not even in a 50-50 kind of relationship, having to take every decision and sort of work it through with somebody else. So I think there's things short of necessarily going all the way to a third party that can still provide some objectivity to how you do maintenance. And I think the question of maintenance, though, may be a little bit smaller than the question of upgrades. I mean, when you're talking about sort of much more larger expenditures, then you may have much different philosophies among the two licensees about how that should be implemented, especially if you have an arrangement where somebody is going to say the other person's going to do this no matter what. Whether I say yes or no, they're going to go ahead and spend the money, and if I say no, then I'm not going to have to spend the money. So you have sort of a free rider issue there that I think you would need to deal with ahead of time, at least, for the sort of major expenditures.
John Cunny, in your experience, have you heard these concerns from clients that might have been considering channel sharing?
In looking at the agreements, I think I agree with what John said. I think it really comes down to scale, and a third-party management team for the station and the tower would make sense in certain situations, possibly in very large stations with large markets. But I think a lot of the participants that are considering this are going to be smaller stations and with not as well financed, and that type of expense really could be difficult for them to add on to their bottom line.
I have a question and a comment. And this is another issue that goes to the contracts, and I'd be interested in what anybody thinks about this. I think we talked a little bit about survivability. What happens if the other party exits? It's the FCC says in its order it's not going to force anybody to. It's not going to play matchmaker. It's going to let the market sort of self-form. But inevitably, one party or the other is going to exit. What happens in that situation? If the FCC, in fact, is not going to force people to sign is not going to force you to share a facility with somebody you don't want to share with, I think a derivative sort of concept is that you're not going to force people to sign up to terms and conditions that they wouldn't otherwise accept. So what happens when one party exits and the surviving licensee does not acquire the selling licensee? Then the FCC now has a license that it needs to relet. It needs to relicense to somebody else. That license, it seems to me, is probably going to have to come burdened with the terms and conditions that were baked into the first agreement between the two licensees that originated it. So are we now sort of institutionalizing through FCC operating rules private contractual relationships that were agreed to, and if this goes on for 40 years, 40 years earlier? I think it's a pretty challenging legal and intellectual problem, and I have no idea how it gets addressed, but I think it's really interesting.
It's an interesting point, but I think at the same time, I don't think the FCC can throw somebody into a commercial arrangement or force you to, sign the deal with somebody else and make that work. I mean, I think, the FCC is, take the situation where somebody loses it. They simply fail to renew it. They want to go out of business or something like that, and they've decided that it's time to just let it lapse. It seems to me, and obviously we don't have rules for this yet, but that the FCC would have to look at that arrangement and say, well, this is sort of like a partnership where surviving member is just going to end up taking over the whole thing again. Because if you think about, that arrangement between the two partners could have been something that involved dynamic channel sharing that, if you inject another party into, how do you deal with that? And so, I almost feel like if it's a lapse, you're not essentially creating a new license there, but essentially what you're doing is reverting back to what you had before. But, you may be able to deal with that in the contract, too. To the extent that they have any rights, they give them up before something like this happens.
And would the FCC allow a party, in effect, to turn in a license and have that license automatically inure to the benefit of another licensee? I mean, that's sort of a special situation. And would the FCC extend that to stations that didn't share in the first instance? Would there be policy reasons not to do that, so that I can acquire two must-carry streams in one license by buying a competitor and turning in the license?
And one of the main purposes of this workshop is to dig deeper into these issues and identify what we need to address in further rulemakings, and clearly this is one of them. But Lana, what were you going to say?
I was just not directly answering John's question, which is a great question. I do think that that's problematic if there are two partners sharing and one partner exits for whatever reason, by against the will or voluntarily. It speaks, I think, to the sharing partner, the remaining sharing partner, being able to have at least a right of first refusal or some sort of priority in terms of that spectrum or that part of the license being assigned or transferred to another or lying fallow to another party or not used at all. I think that, I know that's critically important to our stations because, because of the promise on use of the spectrum, because of the promise and use of facilities. All of the facilities have federal or state funding. We have promises to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting when we receive the federal funding for them. So there are a lot of constraints on our stations to make sure that they use everything from the facilities, from the camera to the actual spectrum wisely and constantly and in the public's best use. So those sorts of questions are really important to us, and I certainly don't have the answer, but I do think in terms of moving forward, that would be an important part of any agreement to make sure that the remaining sharing partner is protected and made whole in those situations.
Hi, Dick Zaragoza again. Alana's point cannot be overemphasized. I think what's so important is that the FCC makes sure that its reversionary rule, the reversionary interest rule, not be an impediment to usual and customary ways that businessmen look at those types of transactions in terms of options, rights of first refusal, what have you. And we need clarity up front, because I think where there's so much uncertainty, what the Commission needs to do is marry its process as close as it can to normal commercial transactions so as to spur the willingness on the part of interested parties to engage in sharing.
I guess as we talk about the right of first refusal, I just like to throw out as a broker that is a value destroying clause, right? So if you have a station that has a right of first refusal on it and you go to sell it, you're going to get significantly less than the market value that you would if you did not have that. I've seen it happen in several transactions. People will not do the diligence and make good offers if they know this right of first refusal exists, and then at the end of the day, you end up with two buyers at one price. They should keep bidding and go higher, right? So it destroys value for the. And as if I was entering into a transaction where I knew that a right of first refusal was being forced on me, I would have pause in doing that. That would be an issue.
Well, that's a very important point. And to Dick's point, our job is to create the right incentives for this to be an attractive option for people who want to contribute spectrum, participate in the proceeds, and stay on the air and continue serving their audiences. So this is duly noted and something that we're going to apply a lot of brain power to. Yes, another question from the audience.
My name is Peter Tannenwald from Fletcher Hill and Hildreth. There are some other situations where there are some precedents, and I don't know what all the results of them are, but there are things we can look at. Anything where there's a mandatory share time situation results in the possibility of shared transmission plant. In low power FM, for example, there are mandatory sharing arrangements, and I have seen situations where two people are forced to share a channel and one goes to the other and says, let me build it and I'll let you use it. and I don't know what arrangements they have. In television, there are distributed antenna system rules where there can be more than one transmitter plant. And while they have to coordinate, it's actually possible for one to own one and one to own the other. In terms of breaking up a deal, I agree with John that a right of first refusal depresses values, but there are many other arrangements. For example, if I were representing somebody in an arrangement like that, in a sharing of a channel, I would offer to them the possibility of a deal whereby at any time one could come to the other and put a dollar number on the table and the recipient has to pay it or take it. It's their choice. I call it a shootout or something of that sort. You would also want to have something for each party, an emergency exit, the right to put your share to the other guy for a fairly low amount of money. And then you can go on from there and have options to buy and all kinds of things. But there are lots of different types of business arrangements that are possible, and technical arrangements that each party who wants to think about sharing is going to have to consider.
Yeah, just to be clear about one thing, I think there's a couple of different scenarios that we're looking at here. I would divide, and sort of my comments before about sort of reversionary interest and things like that, really relate to the situation where the FCC license for some reason disappears by operation of, regulation. Either it's not renewed, it's revoked, it's, there's something that causes that to go away. And I would say that's, you're talking about a very, very small set of exits there. I think the much more common scenario is going to be somebody who wants to exit on a commercial basis, and what you're really talking about there is substituting a different party into the agreement, or bringing somebody else into the arrangement rather than half the license disappear or one of the two licenses disappearing. And I think those are very different circumstances, and I think commercial exits and things like this, there's plenty of different mechanisms, rights of first offer, things like that you can create that can address some of those. So just a
Yeah, and I think depending on the rules the FCC writes, and this may seem pretty far-fetched, but as we go down the path, maybe it'll seem less so. It's not clear to me that the FCC necessarily has to write rules that keeps these parties married to each other forever. If it's in effect creating full license rights in a shared facility, maybe it's possible to set up sort of a host-client relationship, such that if I have a client license, if I can get better economic terms from a different host, I can move to a different facility.
A couple more technical questions that are related. This morning we've been talking about channel sharing as the case with two broadcasters sharing a 6 megahertz channel. So one question is, our report and order contemplates that more than two could share, 3 or 4. The first question there is that feasible, do you believe, with the current transmission technology? We also got, and a related question is one we got over the web relating to broadcast standards, and maybe, Brian, you can chime in on that. The question being, are there broadcast standards that we could move to in the future, say something OFDM-based, that would increase the capacity of 6 megahertz of spectrum and therefore enhance channel sharing either for two broadcasters or possibly more than two? So does anyone want to take the first one? With today's technology, and given the complexity of the arrangements that we've been talking about all morning, do you think having more than two broadcasters on a 6 megahertz channel is at all feasible?
Well, just putting aside the complexities that we've talked about in terms of the policy or the forging the agreements, Peter Tannenbaum just raised, I think, a perfect example of a technology that I think is underutilized and is a distributed transmission system. Our stations operate, our public TV stations operate over 800 translators around this country. Again, because in very remote and rural areas, there are translators that are serving very small communities, very small pockets of population. So their translators are critically important to them. part of the way our stations have been able to use their channels is through the distributed transmission system technology, so that they can have repeaters on their same channel that are going into pockets and serving populations, but are protected from interference because of terrain, like mountains or other things that completely stop the signal. I think that's an interesting point Peter raised, because if we're looking at 3 or 4, I think it'd be, to my knowledge, this has been used by the licensee, him or herself, in terms of making sure that they could reach pockets that otherwise wouldn't be reached because of terrain issues. But it would be interesting to explore that use in terms of multiple licensees.
No, I agree. Brian, anything to add on, what technologies we have to squeeze more capacity out of a 6 megahertz channel?
Yeah, so again, this is Brian Markwalter with CEA. So, a lot of the discussion so far today sounded like one of the channel sharers had to go from HD or SD or couldn't do better than SD. Well, that's not the case. It's pretty clear you can do 2 HDs in an RF channel. You might have to be careful. How many bits you use is dependent on the content, and that's pretty well understood. And there's equipment out there to do it. You can go look at some of the equipment suppliers' websites, and there are cases where they've done this. And clearly then you can do multiple stations. It may be harder. The finances and working out the deals is probably harder than figuring out how to share a few SD channels on one multiplex and broadcast it out. There's another question about sort of where we might go in the future and other modulation. Well, ATSC is looking at that. ATSC is also part of a group called Future Broadcast Television that's international. All the regions are involved. That's just getting underway. So there's interest around the world in a much longer term plan for doing something more efficient. But these are big infrastructure changes, because once you change to a different modulation, this is a wholesale change. This is another transition. So for the kind of things we're talking about today, we're looking at the current standards and MPEG-2 compression. And this will take a while to wind through, but it's clearly doable. And the standard has the what's called PSIP, the information that's transmitted that basically helps the TV build its program guide. It's been able to handle this concept of virtual channels and mixing 2 stations in one RF channel from the very beginning, essentially. So it should be doable.
That's very encouraging.
Rebecca, if I may just add sort of a thought to that, and I certainly would defer to our engineers at the PBS Technology Operations Center. But in talking to them, I agree that probably 2 HD signals are possible, but it certainly impacts the quality of the HD. And so depending on what you're showing in HD, if it's Gem Lair, there's not a lot of action, and so you're okay there. If it's I don't know, a football game or a marching band or a play, Masterpiece Theater, sure, there's a lot of movement and there's a lot more need for a lot of more spectrum for the HD. Can those things be dealt with engineering-wise? Yes, they can, but I do think in terms of what we're talking about, in terms of agreements and policies, I think that those are important issues, because I think we tend to look now at least I do, in terms of using the spectrum. So I'm using it for HD, 2 SDs, data casting, and mobile DTV. If that's going to be dynamically shifting, and if my partner might have HD one time and I might have it the other time, I think that raises a whole nother set of questions in terms of what other implications are touched by that. For us, it's cable agreements, it's satellite agreements. I mean, those were never forged in terms of dynamic allocations, and so we really need to, I think the engineering use is possible, but I do think that that's another set of questions we're going to have to examine with the FCC in terms of what's possible technology-wise, technically. How will that impact our legal and regulatory regimes we've got out there?
Well, for close, I want to make sure that I can address questions that we've received from our web audience. And I'll just read them here. We received 2 questions regarding a shared channel and how a shared channel is protected during the post-auction repacking. The concept being 2 stations are now on a shared channel. Will they be protected in the repacking, or can we assume that they will be moved during the repacking? I think the answer there is yes. Channel sharing whether or not you channel share really does not impact what your situation will be in a repacking. The repacking is going to follow the auction, at which point channel shares will be in place. And so while we are in the process of designing a band plan and getting ready for a repacking process, we haven't finished that yet, so we can't say anything definitive, particularly with respect to what actual television channels would need to be repacked. But what we can say is that when we do have a repacking plan, if a shared television channel is on a frequency that has been reallocated for wireless broadband use, then yes, that channel will be assigned a new television frequency and will be part of the repacking. That channel also, though, will be eligible for reimbursement of its costs. Congress set aside $1.75 billion for us to reimburse broadcasters their costs for moving channels. So we hope that will ease the burden of that process. We got a related question. Is there a plan to change the current in-core broadcast channels from channels 2 to 51 to 2 to 31? That would give the FCC 20 channels, which equates to 120 megahertz, and I believe that is the amount of spectrum the Commission is planning to reclaim from the broadcast band. While we did set out a goal based on industry input of what the wireless broadband needs are going to be in the next 3 to 5 years and beyond, of 120 megahertz, what we're really trying to do in this auction is create a mechanism by which the right amount of spectrum can move to the right licensee for the right price in the right markets. So we're really setting up a clearinghouse, which is what the auction is. We are not, which I think is behind this question, we're not going to just choose a number of TV channels and dedicate them to wireless broadband without understanding what the demand for the wireless broadband is on that side. So what we're trying to do is match the supply with the demand. And as I mentioned earlier, our job, what we're going through now and what we will do over the next couple of months, is to make sure that the proper incentives are in place to bring broadcasters to the supply side of that equation. Let's see, we answered and some of these questions don't relate directly to channel sharing, but I want to take the opportunity to answer them because they are important for an overall understanding of the auction and how broadcasters can participate. I got 2 questions about, will the dollar amount given to the licensee for giving up its 6 megahertz of spectrum be primarily based on the population served? Will the amount of money invested in the equipment also be a factor? And a related question, if a licensee elects to move from UHF to VHF, will the incentive auction pay for the equipment and installation costs as well as pay as an incentive to move? With respect to that second question and the second half of the first question, we are assuming that whatever costs are involved, not relating to moving in the repack, but any costs that are related to the choice of how a broadcaster chose to participate in the auction will be bundled into the reserve price. And if you remember, the reserve price is calculated by the broadcaster, him or herself, and that's the price below which the broadcaster does not have to relinquish its spectrum. With respect to the question of will the price be based on population served, that is really a question of auction design that we're still working through, so we haven't formulated a view on that yet. But what is important in the answer to these questions is that no broadcaster who participates in the auction will have to give up his or her spectrum or any portion thereof at a price lower than he or she sets, him or herself. And with that grammar, we have another question from the floor.
Yeah, hi. I'm Bob Kovacs with TV Technology Magazine. And what I understand is that during the auction that the parties will be encouraged to go to low-band VHF. Broadcasters have kind of been turning up their nose at low-band VHF. In fact, here in D.C., a couple of low-band VHF broadcasters have abandoned their low-band channels and gone to UHF. So is it reasonable to expect that that in the auction that broadcasters will have enough incentive to move to low-band VHF?
Well, excuse me. What we tried to do, beginning with the National Broadband Plan, is come up with enough creative, flexible options for broadcasters to participate in a variety of ways depending on their particular business circumstances. So, yes, we believe that for some broadcasters there is a business case for them to look at their broadcast situation and make a business decision to move to the VHF, a move for which they will be compensated for in their reserve price. Unlike channel sharing, moving to VHF is a question of giving up your reception ability. Because of interference in the VHF that doesn't exist in the UHF after the digital transition, coverage can sometimes be compromised in certain VHF situations. But it's that compromise of coverage which would be the basis for that broadcaster to be compensated in the incentive auction. And that's the market-based mechanism that we believe will result in the proper incentives for that kind of broadcaster.
Thanks.
If it's right for them. And if it's not, then there are other options, or there's another option, which is to stay on the air. Okay, going back to some web questions. In your estimation, when would be the earliest the incentive auction would begin? Well, as everyone's heard this morning, there's a variety of very complex issues that we still have to resolve, and we will begin addressing those questions with one or more NPRMs that we're working on now, and we anticipate that those NPRMs will be out in the fall. But other than that, that's the schedule that we're working on now. So it's difficult to say when the actual auction will happen, but we do anticipate that the procedure will kick off with this NPRM in the fall. There is currently a freeze to change channels. However, the FCC has been accepting waivers to change channels. At this time, is it still permissible for a full-service facility to request a channel change from VHF to UHF with a request for a waiver? And we have Sean here. I believe the channel changes that we are accepting now are to move out of channel 51. But other than that, we are not honoring any channel changes. The idea there being that we need to stop the traffic in the band while we assess and plan for this auction and the rebanding that will occur after that. And one final question, how will the rules change to protect wireless stations operating on broadcast channels and vice versa? I think this is a question of service rules, and that will be part of we can't speak to that now in this forum, but I believe that wireless interference protection and TV broadcast interference protection will be subject for the service rules that will be subject to a future rulemaking as well. And that seems to be it. I have a question from the audience that I confess is a little difficult to read. I'm just having trouble reading the writing. So if anyone wants to ask this question, feel free. Otherwise, if there are any other questions or any other comments that anyone wants to respond to with or questions I just asked? No?
Mark Vanberg, something that came up during the break that was discussed among a number of folks I heard, including myself, were the must-carry issues related, and they're different for commercial broadcasters where you have a must-carry retransmission consent environment, and the public station or non-commercial environment where it's primarily must-carry. As I understand it, the must-carry rights or obligations sort of go from the shared transmitter site One of the questions that came up, I think, was sort of in response to an earlier comment maybe by John about a small signal station sharing with a much larger signal station, and that has an obvious impact potentially on must-carry rights. The cable industry may or may not be happy about that. You have one small cable operator, large cable operator, that may not like new additional must-carry obligations, that challenges the new rules. How does that play in? It just seems a very complicated scenario if folks could sort of address where they are now and what further complications could arise.
Well, our intention, which we also believe is reflected in the statute, is that the obligation for cable and satellite systems to carry must-carry channels really doesn't change at all. It's a net zero for them because whatever must-carry rights would exist at the new site where the shared channels are broadcasting from, those would not increase or decrease. Essentially, the obligation to carry those channels would be the same as what they are today. So we don't anticipate any increase. At least that was our intention.
Well, here, if you've got a small a station with a small contour, its must-carry rights are predicated on good signal reaching the head end of a cable operator. If it now moves its facilities to share with another station in the market which has a much larger contour, does it expand the must-carry rights because that contour is that much larger? Maybe it's in the same market, but now that signal is reaching more head ends. And so cable operators that didn't have a previous must-carry obligation for that small signal station would now have a must-carry obligation when its signal expands in reach due to the sharing arrangement.
Well, Mark, they still have the obligation. They just weren't delivering a good quality signal.
Right, so the cables
by fiber. So
Right, but
so
if
just view it as an alternative signal delivery mechanism.
Right, but that cable system may not be carrying if the broadcaster wasn't using alternate arrangements to deliver the signal to the head end. There's no must-carry obligation at that point on the part of the cable operator, which then could change because now that good signal quality is reaching the head end over the air.
And they won't like that.
Right.
But that's the situation today, right? If they decide to deliver a good, I think the bigger question is, when you go into channel sharing, if you are a must-carry station going into channel sharing, which I think probably most of the candidates probably are must-carry stations, at least what I would consider the client stations. One of the things you have to consider is how important must-carry is to you and how long you think it's going to survive in the courts, and will it survive forever, and what happens if it doesn't. And I think there are certainly ways you can mitigate that risk in your contractual relationship with the host station, but it's absolutely something you have to consider. But that's crystal ball stuff, right? We don't know.
And I would just add, I think Mark raises a good point, and John's actually emphasized the critical piece of this. I mean, we're all expecting that the current must-carry retransmission consent regime lasts, and we know there are bills on the Hill that might disrupt some of that. But I do think the important piece, and I mentioned this earlier, is when you're looking at two stations sharing, I think a critical piece of the contour question is which head ends are being reached, because that's very important for continuing service to those populations. I also think I do think that the most logical sharing arrangement is between two must-carry stations, but it does raise some interesting questions if commercial, non-commercial channels shared and they were under different carriage regimes where those agreements may go in that direction. So I don't have any of those answers, but there are questions that we've been thinking about.
Okay, well, that seems like a good place to end. Would you thank me or join me in thanking the panelists, because I spent a lot of time and effort helping us out with these questions. Thank you all very much.